Hi guys, thanks for checking out my content. First off, let me say what this video is not going to cover. This is going to be a long video, so I don't want anyone to waste their time. This video is not going to cover anything to do with mixing drums, so if you're looking for a tutorial on how to mix them, then look elsewhere. I haven't ruled out doing a video on that in the future, and people have asked me to. For now, I think that there are other people who are more qualified to do that than me. But if you do want me to do a video, if you like this one, then let me know and I'll definitely consider it. So with that out of the way, what this video is going to cover is how I have my Pro Tools session set up for drum programming, an overview of the samples available in my current go-to library, which is GetGood Drums Modern and Massive, how I have contacts set up with faders and velocity curves, and some general tips with programming drums, and then a final unmixed and then mixed demonstration of the finished result. I will put timestamps for each section in the description below because again this is going to be long. Just a quick note, this is how I approach drum programming. This isn't the right way to do it, but it is the way that works for me. So the first thing I'll go over is how I have my Pro Tools session set up for when I program drums. This is a template that I created for Modern and Massive specifically. I do vary it depending on what I'm using. As you can see, I have one track for each drum, and the output section on Contact is being routed to each of these, which I'll show in the next section. I'm not going to be going over how to do that because the GetGood Drums guys have already put out a bunch of videos for various DAWs on how to do this. I definitely recommend you watch them if you're wondering how to do this yourself. The reason for doing this is so that when I've finished programming, I can print out the finished drum multitracks so that I can then import them into my mix session. Some drum samplers like Superior Drummer have this feature built in, so if I'm using Superior, I don't need any of this and I would just work with the single instrument track. This bit is less important, but I will show you. This is how I have my faders set up in the programming session. All I've done here is adjust the levels so that when I listen to the programming it sounds like a rough balance. And certain instruments, like the hat, come out pretty loud, so I like to have that turned down. And I've also done a little bit of panning. Also the large diaphragm condenser track I have muted because I don't use it, but I do still like to export it so that I have the option if I do want to change my mind later. So these print sends on the tracks, those are if I wanted to export a single file. So if I was working on something for someone else and I wanted to just send them a single file, rather than the entire multi-tracks just to get their opinion, then what I would do is create a new audio track, set the input to print, record enable, and then you can just record the what is being sent to it, and you can adjust these levels. I have them at -3, so they don't have the same balance on, but you can adjust it however you want. Okay, so this is GetGood Drums Modern and Massive. What I'm going to do for now is go through each sample and show what they sound like and give my opinion on what styles of music I think they are most useful for. If you already own Modern and Massive or you don't want to hear me go through all the samples, then you can skip to part 3 of the video and I'll put a timestamp on where that is now. The reason I'm going to go over the samples is because I think it is very important to learn the tools that you're using. So for those of you who are using Modern and Massive, this will hopefully help. If you're using any other drum sampler, I still highly recommend putting the time in to learn what the samples actually sound like and how you can best use them. There is a time and place for tinkering and experimenting, but if you're needing to work quickly, you can save a lot of time by having this knowledge going into whatever the project is. So first off is the snare, and the first sample that they give us for the snare is the Q Drum aluminium snare. This one is the default snare, but it is probably my least favorite in the pack. Next up is the Yamaha snare, which I like for massive sounding rock music, although I find it a bit less appropriate for faster genres of metal. Next is the Vinnie Paul Signature, which is in the GetGood Drums preset for pop punk. This one is solid for pretty much everything. It's versatile and it's a fairly safe choice. Next is the Guru Paduak snare, which is probably my favorite one. It sounds very natural. I've used it for rock, metal, and everything in between. Next is the Guru Sobrano snare. Similar to the Yamaha, I think. It sounds absolutely massive, so I find it works really well as like an extra layer during choruses and breakdowns. Next is the Gretsch. It sounds really aggressive, so I love it for anything fast like death metal or thrash metal or anything with blast beats. Next is the Gretsch High, which I believe is the same snare but tuned higher. I don't really use this one because I just prefer the other one, but this is what it sounds like. Next is the Ludwig. Sounds amazing for metal, and it's a fairly safe starting point. Next is the VK Copper Snare. I don't use this one very often, but the GetGood guys have put it on the preset for dry and natural, so if you want that kind of sound, then definitely give it a go. Okay, next up is the kicks. The first kick is the Q drum kick, and as with the snare, it's the factory setting, and as with the snare, it is probably my least favorite of the kick samples on here. Next is the Yamaha, which I think is really good for the sort of modern djenty kick sound. It's usually the one that I pick, and I love the attack in the like 1-2K area. Next is the Pearl, which is on the pop punk preset. I don't use this one too often, but it sounds solid. Next is the Guru Paduak kick, which I think sounds good for a classic metal sound. Next is the Guru Walnut kick, which is super tight and defined, so it sounds amazing for modern metal. Last one is the Tama, which is a great all-rounder. You can't really go wrong with this one. So next is the toms. So for the rack tom and the first floor tom, you have the same 6 samples to choose from. For the second floor tom, there are only 2. So first I'll go through the rack tom and the first floor tom. So first off is the Q drum toms, which I really like, even though I wasn't a massive fan of their snare or kick. Next is the Yamaha, which, as expected, works really well for any kind of rock or metal. Next is the Pearl toms, which are the highest tuned toms in the pack, so if you do need particularly high toms, then you may want to consider these. These are also in the pop punk preset. Next is the Guru Paduak toms. These sound really big and aggressive, so they're great for modern metal. Next is the Guru Walnut toms. These are similar to the Guru Paduak ones, but they're even more aggressive and even bigger. So in isolation, I think they probably sound the best, but in the context of a whole kit, I usually prefer the next ones on the list. And finally is the Tama toms, which are usually my go-to. Okay, the last drum to show here is the lowest floor tom. First up is the Q drum floor tom, which sounds like this. And finally, the Yamaha, which I prefer over the Q one because it's a little bit tighter and a little bit more defined. So for the cymbals, there aren't as many options, so I'll quickly show my favorites and what they sound like. So for the hats, I prefer these ones over these ones. They both sound solid, but I usually like higher hats. So those ones are usually the ones I go for. For the left crash, the 18-inch Meinl. I love that one. This is what the other one sounds like. So for the right crash, I like the 20-inch Meinl medium. This is the heavy. For the splash and china, we do only get one choice, but they both sound amazing. So this is what they sound like. And for the ride, we get two. This one, I think, sounds brilliant. This one, I unfortunately do not like. Okay, so I'm now going to go through how I have Kontakt set up specifically for Modern and Massive. This is going to show some of the cool things that you can do with MIDI drums that would be impossible or extremely difficult with live drums. If you're using a different library, then you may still find this useful, but I'm only going to be showing Modern and Massive. So the first cool feature of Modern and Massive is the Turbo mode, which applies Nolly's processing to that track, and you can enable it or disable it on a track-by-track basis. I only use it on a couple of tracks because I like to keep my options open, but the ones I use it on, I almost always leave it just on full. So first off, with the kick, I usually don't bother with a sub track, which is why I have both the kick and the sub routed to kick, which is over here. I do like to have turbo mode engaged on the sub track. The large diaphragm condenser track on all of these, as I said before, you can ignore because I have that muted, so I haven't really played around with the levels. I did bring up the kick in the mono room because I like to have lots of kick and snare in the mono room so that I can smash the shit out of it later on with compression. And I have brought the kick down in the far room because that is where I want there to be a lot of snare, and I don't want it to be full of kicks. For the snare, I've brought the far room and the mono room tracks up quite a bit. Having lots of snare in the far room can be a good alternative to adding room samples to the snare track itself. For the toms, I brought them up in the overheads a little bit because I like to have lots of toms there. I've also brought them down quite a lot in the mono room track because I like wide toms and I don't want them coming out mono in the middle and messing up the compression that I know I'm going to do later on to the kick and the snare. For the cymbals, I found that I had to pump up the hats and the ride all the way for them to come out at an appropriate volume compared to everything else. I did also engage turbo mode on both of them. It just adds a little bit of EQ, and I just think it straight up makes them sound better. So the only thing I do with levels in the overheads is I brought down the hi-hats because for some reason they came out much louder than everything else. Maybe it's because of how I have all of this set up, or it could be because I'm using the small diaphragm condenser instead of the large. But either way, I just brought them down to there. All the other faders in the overhead and room tracks, as well as the snare bleeds, I left at default. Some people like to totally remove bleed, but having tried both, I almost always prefer to leave the bleed at least enabled, although sometimes I might turn it down. This is basically just an additional degree of control that you would not usually have when working with live drums. The last thing I'm going to go into for this section is how I set up the velocity curves. This is very important because if you have something already programmed using Superior Drummer or Slate or DrumForge or anything else, and you load it into GetGood drums and you just copy these settings, it's probably going to sound like crap. This is because the velocity curves are not going to be the same across different software, and more importantly, the layering of the samples is not going to be the same, which I'm going to go into in the next section of this video. When I do drum programming for other people, I always make sure I tell them how I had these velocity curves set, so they can either copy my settings if they're using the same samples, or they can be aware of it when they set it up themselves on whatever drum program they're using. Some of these are set to default. Some of them I adjusted so that they react in a way that I'm more used to. This may not work for you at all, so I'd suggest that you play around with them, but these are the settings that I have as my default for when I write drum parts. So the first and most basic element of drum programming is to understand what a drummer can and cannot play before focusing on what a drummer would or would not play. Some of this is fairly obvious, like remembering that most drummers only have 2 feet and 2 hands available at any one time, but it's also important to remember the speed at which drummers can or cannot transition from one part of the kit to another. This is very important to remember when programming velocities as well, because if a drummer has to move rapidly from one side of the kit to the other, they're not going to be hitting the drums as hard. One example that I'd like to share is Mike Mangini's performance of The Enemy Inside by Dream Theater. So Mangini uses two ride cymbals. He's got one on the left of his kit and one on the right. This means that he is able to play fast 16th notes on the rides, alternating left and right, while maintaining the rhythm on the snare. To show you exactly what I mean, this is a clip from my drum transcription of this song. So if this part were to be played on a more conventional kit, like if this ride didn't exist, then the drummer would have to keep his arms in this area, which would make doing anything over here on the hi-hat a lot more difficult. And he would have to move his left arm a much greater distance in order to hit the ride after hitting the snare. This is likely not impossible, but it is something to be aware of. When you program your drums, it's entirely up to you how much realism you go for. I usually compromise on things like this, especially if I'm using Modern and Massive. But I think it is at least important to be aware of these physical limitations of a real drummer. So the next important part of drum programming is timing. No drummer, no matter how good they are, will ever hit two things at exactly the same time. When real drums are edited for a song, the goal is usually to make them sound like they are in time with the click or the other instruments without taking away from the original performance. Usually, gridding the drummer completely is going to be undesirable. With programmed drums, I use the same philosophy but backwards. So what the goal is with drum programming is to take something that is totally gridded and robotic and add just enough timing deviations to where it could pass for an edited live performance. There are multiple ways to do this. Usually what I do is I quantize each note with a degree of randomness based on tempo. Usually I'm anywhere between sort of 10 and 30%. And then I go over each individual drum, so kick, then snare, then toms, then cymbals, and move some notes closer or further away by hand. If you're going to use a tool like this, don't just slap it on everything and hit go and think that it's humanized, because it's not. It's humanized by a computer, which gets rid of the entire point. So a couple of tips. First of all, do all drum fills by hand using slip editing. So rather than doing this, I suggest that you do this. Not exactly the same drum fill, but hopefully you will agree that the second one sounds like it could have at least been played by a real drummer. Next one, tip number 2. Faster parts can usually be moved further from the grid than slower parts without sounding out of time. This is because if the tempo is faster, then the gap between the notes is shorter, which means that there's less chance for our ears to be able to detect something that is out of time. Tip number 3, it's not uncommon for drummers to be early with their hi-hat, so sometimes I slide these forward by a few milliseconds. So if you've got a traditional rock beat where it's kick, snare with a consistent hat, the hat is going to be played with the right hand. Right-handed drummer, they may well be early if they're playing to a click, so that way they can hear the click in their ear. So a lot of the time if I'm doing something that is a traditional rock beat like that, just take all the hats and slide them forwards by X. It's up to you to decide. So tip number 4, things might get weird if you bump two simultaneous notes apart by more than 5 milliseconds. 5 milliseconds is about the margin of error where our ears will detect something that sounds out of time. So what you got to remember is that if you move like this snare and this kick are supposed to be played at the same time. It's supposed to sound like this. If you move the snare too far away, it sounds like this. And that's only a small difference, but if you then do the same with the kick, like if you're randomizing by percentages using the quantize menu, and the computer decides to move the snare one way and the kick the other way by 20%, which isn't that much, what you end up with is a 40% difference, which sounds like shit. Tip number 5, you can be far more relaxed with cymbals usually than you can with shells, because shells have a much more obvious and defined transient. Our ears are going to perceive them as being out of time much easier. And finally, tip number 6, flamming is not always undesirable. Anyone who's heard a sloppy drummer play 16th notes on the kick while keeping time with the snare knows what I'm talking about. It will sound something like this. So notice that the snares are not actually in time, and they are flamming with the kicks to varying degrees. Obviously, we don't want our programmed drums to sound like a shitty real drummer, but there are some times where flams can sound great. I think this is a good example of that. So during slower drum fills, where two drums are hit at the same time, so in this case snare and toms, they can sound like this, which adds an extra degree of realism. So compare that to this if I grid it. And there you have the difference. So now your drums should have human timing but inhuman consistency, because every hit is going to be at 127. When working with MIDI drums, you can adjust the velocity of each hit. It will cause a different sample to be played inside your drum sampler. If done wrong, or not done at all, it is the single biggest giveaway that your drums have been programmed and they will sound something like this. A lot of the time I see people ask, what velocities should I use for blast beats, or what velocity works best for ghost notes? I see these questions pop up all the time, and unfortunately there is no one-size-fits-all. If you're asking these questions, you need to learn your velocities for your drum sampler. The reason I'm saying this is because if I'm using Superior Drummer, and I tell you that I like to put my blast beats at a velocity of between 70 and 80, this will not translate directly unless you are using the exact same sampler with the exact same samples and the exact same velocity curves. The number blast beats between 70 and 80 is a completely arbitrary number that doesn't actually mean anything without any context. Most drum programming software allows you to change the velocity curves of each drum. And although this is very helpful when translating MIDI, it is not going to be a case of simply matching the curve because the samples are not going to be layered in the same way. As an example of this, I have a short dynamic piece of MIDI that I programmed using Modern and Massive that I will play once through Modern and Massive, and then I'll play the exact same piece of MIDI again through Superior Drummer. And now here's the same piece through Superior Drummer. Pay attention in particular to the snares. So my opinion there is that it doesn't sound bad, but it sounds like a different drummer. It sounds like a different performance. What I recommend you do, if you want to learn your velocities, is take each drum and slide the velocity slider up and down, and listen to each hit. So in this case, snare. You can hear, or you should be able to hear, that it isn't linear. There are times when the way the drummer is hitting when this was sampled changes at set amounts. What those exact numbers are, I'm not sure. This is a large part of why MIDI will not translate directly, is because unless everyone decided, okay, everything above 120 is a rim shot and everything below 50 is a ghost note, it's never going to translate one-to-one. So one thing that can help greatly when understanding drum velocities and making them sound realistic is to directly match them with a real drum track. Here I have a live snare track, and I've added MIDI notes here for triggering. There are a ton of advantages to triggering from MIDI instead of audio, but for now I'm just using this as an example to show how to practice velocities. This instrument track here is just for monitoring, so I've got trigger, which is going to play a sample, and this MIDI is being sent to trigger. So you can see here, trigger. So this is what the original snare track sounds like. This is a real drummer. And if we leave our velocities at 127, this is what it sounds like. Yeah, so as you can tell, it sounds like a robot, even though the timing is correct to the original performance. So just so that you're aware, the snare that I picked here is the Modern and Massive VK Drums Copper. The reason I picked that is because it sounds fairly similar to the original snare. So what we can do here is we can listen to the original performance, and we can then play around with the velocities here and listen to what that does to the drum sample. And if we do that hit by hit, what we end up with is this. So that's barely even a hit. Like even there is too loud, I think here. So one thing I will say is that you can save time by looking at the waveform rather than listening to every single hit and programming it. But if you're going to do this, then go back in and make sure that you were right, because all you're doing there is you're guessing. And a large peak on a waveform doesn't necessarily mean that the drummer was hitting the drum harder than a small peak. So then what we end up with is this. And if I mute the original snare, so it doesn't sound exactly the same, but that took me all of about a minute to do. So if you do put some time into it and learn how your velocities work on whichever drums you're using, you can get results that sound like a real drummer. So here's a few tips for handling drum velocities. Number one, learn your velocity layers. This is the most important thing, in my opinion, when it comes to programming realistic drums. Number two, study real drummers. Transcribe some of their work. Expand your bag of tricks. Knowing how to work the velocities of your drum software doesn't matter if you don't know in your head what you want your drum parts to sound like. And number three, air drumming. Air drumming is incredibly useful. I'm not a drummer. I can't even play the most basic 4/4 rock beat on a drum kit. But I air drum everything that I write. If you don't have drumsticks, use pencils like I do. Figure out how hard you would hit each drum and translate that into your MIDI programming. The final thing to mention about drum programming is articulations. This is entirely dependent on your sample library, but most drum software will include at least some of the following: flams, stick hits, rim shots, cymbal swells, hi-hat chicks, roughs, side sticks, cymbal bells, cymbal edges, rim only, brush hits, brush drags, mutes, cymbal chokes, and probably a whole load that I've forgotten. These can sometimes be recreated without having a dedicated sample, but when given the option, I usually prefer to use the provided sample. There isn't really much I can say here about how to use these, except to learn what they are, what they sound like, and when a real drummer uses them. Apart from that, don't overdo them. Think of them like ear candy, and too much ear candy makes your ears get fat. Okay, so now final section, I'm going to show 2 audio clips of my drum programming where I applied everything that I've been talking about. These clips are from a song on my album Minimum Safe Distance, which is going to be released on the 9th of November, so 1 week from when I release this video. I will put a link in the description when it's available. For this particular project, the samples I selected were the Yamaha kick, the Guru Purdue X snare, the Tama rack and floor tom, and the Yamaha low floor tom. In the first example, you're going to hear the drum part played in isolation with no mixing or any processing. It's just basic leveling. So that will show what GetGood drums sounds like completely raw with humanizing. In the second example, I'm just going to play the finished mix of the song with all the other instruments engaged. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video useful. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to message me. I'm always looking for ways to improve my work. Enjoy.